It began on a night that felt heavier than any I could remember. The kind where the air clung to your skin and the silence pressed against your ears like an uninvited weight. Outside, rain hit the glass in an unsteady rhythm, not soft, not soothing, but sharp each drop, a reminder of how quiet the rest of the world was. I sat at my desk, the dim lamp beside me barely cutting through the gloom, shadows pooling in the corners like dark water. My phone lay face up, the screen black, as if it had been dead for hours. But I knew it wasn't. I'd been checking it constantly, flicking it awake, staring at the empty home screen before the glow faded back into nothing. No messages, no calls, not a single word from anyone. Earlier that day, I'd received yet another rejection, this time from the one opportunity I'd been clinging to like it was the last rope holding me above the pit. The email had been short, almost cold. "We regret to inform you." The words blurred after that. I didn't even finish reading it. I'd seen enough. I'd read too many just like it. Every time I told myself I could handle one more. Every time. I promised myself I'd get back up. But that night felt different. That night felt final. I'd told myself weeks ago that this would be the last attempt, the final push. If it didn't work out, I'd stop. Not just stop trying for that dream, but stop everything. The weight of failure had been piling up, brick after brick, until I was buried in it. There was no more room to breathe. I'd convinced myself there was no point in taking another step. If every road led to the same dead end, the room felt like it was shrinking around me. The walls seemed too close, the ceiling too low. I caught my reflection in the black screen of my phone-pale eyes, tired, like I'd been carrying a storm behind them for years. And in that reflection, I saw someone who wasn't winning, someone who wasn't even fighting anymore. I saw someone who had reached their breaking point. My chest tightened, as if invisible hands were squeezing my ribs. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the floor while my thoughts began to spiral. The rejections, the failures, the faces of people who had told me you're not good enough. Whether they meant it outright or implied, it flashed through my mind like an old film reel, frame after frame, faster and faster. My own voice joined theirs, a cruel echo. "You've wasted your time. You're never going to make it. You should quit." I swallowed hard, but the dryness in my throat wouldn't go away. The air felt stale, and every breath seemed to catch halfway. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound filling the room like a warning I didn't want to hear. I wanted to shut it all out, the noise, the thoughts, the whole day, but the truth was, there was no shutting it out. It was inside me, crawling under my skin. I reached for my phone again, even though I knew there was nothing new on it. My thumb hesitated over the screen, but I didn't turn it on this time. I just held it, feeling the cold weight of it in my hand, realizing how ridiculous it was that I'd spent so much of my life waiting for something, some call, some message, some sign that would never come. And in that moment, I wondered why I'd been waiting at all. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe tomorrow I'd feel different, but I didn't believe it, not really. I could feel the line in the sand. I could feel that I was right there, at the edge of deciding to let it all go. Not because I wanted to, but because I was too worn out to keep going. My mind was whispering that giving up wasn't the worst thing I could do, that maybe it would even be a relief. And that was the most dangerous thought of all. The lamp's glow flickered once, and my heart skipped. For a split second, the room was darker than it should have been, the shadows in the corners seeming to stretch, creep closer. I blinked, shook my head, told myself it was nothing, but my pulse didn't slow. I could feel something tightening around me, not physically, but in the way the air shifted, the kind of tension you can't explain but can't ignore. That's when I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out slowly, but it didn't make me feel lighter. If anything, it made the heaviness more real. It was all around me, and inside. Me too, pressing in from both sides. The ticking clock on the wall sounded too loud. The hum of the refrigerator in the other room sounded too far away. And the rain. It didn't stop. I stared down at my hands, noticing the faint tremor in them. I thought about all the people who wouldn't notice if I stopped trying. All the people who would barely shrug if I disappeared from the race entirely. The thought didn't make me angry, it made me feel hollow. And somewhere in that hollowness, in that low breaking point, I realized I had a choice to make. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now, the choice was simple, really. I could let the night swallow me, let the weight crush me until I became part of it. Or I could take one breath, one step, just enough to keep from sinking. I didn't know if I had the strength for a step, let alone the whole climb. But I knew if I didn't do something right then, I wouldn't do anything at all. So I sat there, still holding my phone in my cold hand, listening to the rain, feeling the walls pressing in, and I decided that even if this was the last bit of fight I had left, I would spend it. Because if this was the end, I didn't want it to be the kind where I let the dark win without lifting a hand. It wasn't hope. It wasn't courage. Not yet, but it was a refusal. And for that moment, it was enough. The next morning was grey. Not the kind of grey that comes before a storm, but the dull, lifeless kind that drains the colour out of everything. The world outside my window looked muted, like it was covered in a thin film of dust. Even the air felt heavier, as though it hadn't moved in hours. I didn't wake up because I wanted to, I woke up because I couldn't stay asleep any longer. My mind had been restless all night, tossing me from one half-formed thought to another, never letting me sink fully into rest. When I finally sat up, my body ached like I'd been carrying something all night in my dreams. I stayed there on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to decide if there was any point in standing up. The thought of going through another day felt exhausting before it even began. My phone was still on the nightstand, the same cold rectangle I'd been gripping the night before. I didn't touch it this time. I didn't want to look at the messages that weren't there or the calls that hadn't come. Instead, I just sat there, listening to the faint hum of the outside world. A world that seemed to be moving on perfectly fine without me. The kettle in the kitchen whistled faintly in my mind, though I hadn't actually put it on. That was the strange thing about mornings like this. Sure, thoughts start filling in the silence with sounds that aren't there. I finally pushed myself to my feet, dragging one slow step after another toward the window. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty street below, where nothing and no one was moving. I thought about the night before, about the choice I'd made in that moment of heaviness. It hadn't felt like a victory, more like a stubborn breath in a room with no air. I'd told myself I wouldn't give up, but saying it in the dark and proving it in daylight were two very different things. In daylight, the weight came back, sharper, more deliberate, reminding me of everything I still didn't have, everything I'd failed to do. I wandered into the kitchen and filled the kettle, the sound of water splashing against metal louder than it needed to be. It echoed in the quiet. I set it on the stove and stood there, not turning the flame on right. Away, just listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock. Each tick felt like it was pushing me forward, even though I didn't want to move. The truth was, I didn't know what to do next. I didn't have a plan, and part of me didn't believe one would make a difference. All I had was that decision I'd made, don't give up, and the vague sense that if I was going to honor it, I'd have to find something to hold on to, even if it was just a thread. But what? Everything I'd been working toward had felt like sand slipping through my fingers. I poured my coffee and sat at the table, cradling the mug in both hands, watching the steam curl and vanish. The warmth seeped into my fingers, and for a second, it was the only thing keeping me here in the moment. I tried to think about why I'd started in the first place, why I'd taken those first steps toward the dream that now felt so far away. I remembered the early days when I'd felt unstoppable, when I'd thought the world would eventually notice if I just kept working hard enough. Back then, I'd believed that persistence was a guarantee, that no matter how many doors closed, there'd always be one left open. But somewhere along the way, the doors had stopped opening, and that belief had begun to rot. As I stared into the dark swirl of my coffee, I realized the decision to not give up didn't mean much without action. It wasn't some magic spell that would change everything overnight. It was a choice I'd have to make over and over, not once, but every single time I wanted to quit. The night before had been one choice. This morning would have to be another, and tomorrow would be another after that. The thought of doing it endlessly was overwhelming, but maybe that wasn't the way to think about it. Maybe I only needed to think about this day. Just this one. I took a slow sip, letting the bitter taste ground me. Then I pulled my notebook from the counter. The cover was worn, the pages filled with notes, ideas, and plans that hadn't worked. I flipped past all of them until I found a blank page. My pen hovered above it, and I hesitated. The page felt like a Duran, open space, daring me to try again. I didn't know what to write. My hand moved anyway. I started with something small, one thing I could do today that would move me an inch closer to where I wanted to be. Not a mile, not a leap, just an inch. My handwriting was shaky, uneven, but it was there in ink. Something about seeing it written down made it more real. It wasn't just floating around in my head anymore, waiting to fade. I set the notebook down and finished my coffee. Outside, the sky hadn't brightened much, but there was a subtle shift, a lightening around the edges of the clouds. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it meant rain later. But I stood up anyway, because the day was waiting. I didn't feel inspired. I didn't feel strong. But I'd promised myself I wouldn't give up, and promises, even the quiet ones, have a way of keeping you moving when nothing else will. And so, one small, unremarkable step at a time, I started the day. By midday, the quiet had started pressing in on me. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that hums against your skin, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every breath, every creak of the floorboards, every faint movement. Outside the window, I sat at the table, my notebook still open, the page from earlier staring back at me. I'd written one thing, just one small action for the day, and yet it felt like it was demanding more from me than I was ready to give. The thing about deciding not to give up is that it doesn't always come with a surge of motivation. Sometimes it's just a stale taste in your mouth, a dull ache in your chest, and a faint awareness that the alternative, quitting, would be worse. I looked at what I'd written again, tracing the words with my eyes. It was such a simple, task. If anyone else saw it, they'd probably laugh at how small it seemed. But for me, it wasn't small at all. It was the edge of a cliff, and I was trying to convince myself to step forward without looking down. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes wander to the window. Outside, the wind had picked up, tugging at the loose leaves scattered across the pavement. They skittered along the ground like they were running from something, only to stop suddenly when the gusts faded. I felt a strange kinship with them, being pushed forward in short bursts, then left in stillness, not sure which direction to go next. I thought about everything I'd lost, not just opportunities or time, but parts of myself I'd given away. In the process, the optimism I'd carried when I started, the certainty that hard work would pay off, the easy belief that the world was fair in some way. Those pieces were gone, worn down by failure after failure, and yet, here I was, still holding onto this thin thread of persistence, even though I didn't know why anymore. I turned back to the notebook, my pen resting between my fingers. I told myself I'd just start, not finish, just start. That was all I needed to do. I wrote a single line, my handwriting slanted and impatient. Then another line, and another. It wasn't much. In fact, it was messy, scattered, unpolished. But the page wasn't blank anymore. The white emptiness was gone, replaced by the scratch of ink. It was proof that I'd done something, however small, to move forward. The sound of my phone buzzing on the counter made me flinch. I hadn't been expecting anyone to call or text, so the noise felt almost intrusive. I got up and checked it, just a notification from an app I barely used. Nothing important. Still, it pulled me out of the rhythm I'd been trying to build. And suddenly, I felt that weight in my chest again. It's strange how progress, no matter how small, can be so fragile. One interruption, one thought, and it all feels like it's slipping. I made myself sit back down. If I left now, I knew I wouldn't come back to it. The temptation to walk away, to tell myself I'd get back to it later, was strong, but I'd played that game too many times before. Later rarely came. The afternoon light shifted, stretching shadows across the floor. They crept slowly, as if they were trying to catch me in my seat. I kept writing, not fast, not easily, but steadily. Enough to keep the ink flowing. And with each sentence, something unexpected happened. I started to remember the way it used to feel in the early days, when the work itself was enough, when it wasn't about recognition or reward, but about creating something that hadn't existed before. That feeling didn't come rushing back, just lingered at the edges, like a faint smell of something familiar you can't quite place. There was a part of me that wanted to cling to that spark, but another part didn't trust it. I'd felt it before, only to have it fade when the next setback came. Still, it was there, and maybe it was worth protecting. I paused for a moment, letting my pen hover above the page. My hand was tired, my neck stiff, but I realized I'd been working longer than I thought. The page in front of me was nearly full. I didn't remember most of what I'd written. My mind had been somewhere between focus and daydream, but the ink was proof. The choice I'd made that morning was still holding, at least for now. It struck me that this was what not giving up actually looked like. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a burst of adrenaline or some grand turning point. It was the sit in a chair when I wanted to walk away, writing words I wasn't sure anyone would ever see, continuing without knowing if it would matter in the end. When I finally set my pen down, the light outside had softened into the golden haze of late afternoon. I stretched, my joints popping in quiet protest. I stood by the window again, watching. The world in its muted motion. The wind had slowed, and the leaves outside lay still, scattered where they'd been left, and for the first time in a while, I didn't feel like one of them. The days that followed felt heavier than they should have. It wasn't because of some massive disaster or tragedy, at least not one anyone else could see. It was the slow, suffocating weight of carrying a choice you'd already made and knowing you couldn't set it down even when you wanted to. I had decided I wouldn't give up, and that decision clung to me like a shadow. It was there in the quiet moments when I was alone, and it was there in the noise of everyday life, tugging at me, reminding me that the easiest path walking away was the one I'd promised myself I wouldn't take. Morning became the hardest part of the day. I'd wake up with that brief, blissful fog where nothing mattered yet, where my mind hadn't remembered the promises I'd made to myself, but it never lasted long. By the time I sat at the edge of the bed, the truth would sink in. The work was still waiting, the obstacles were still there, and no one was going to do any of it for me. That knowledge was a constant hum in the background, making every movement feel deliberate and slow. As though I was dragging myself through water. On the third morning, I almost broke. I sat in the kitchen with my coffee, staring at the steam, curling up from the mug, and told myself that quitting would feel like a relief. I imagined walking away, closing the door on all of it, and letting the weight slide off my shoulders. The picture in my head was so tempting it was almost real. But then, something else slipped into the edges of that thought and image of what it would feel like months from now. When I looked back and realized I had stopped just short of breaking through, that feeling was heavier than the one I carried now, and I knew I couldn't face it. So I stayed in my seat, watching the coffee cool, and told myself I'd try for one more day. Just one. The hours after that were a blur of small, stubborn choices. Picking up the notebook instead of the remote. Opening my laptop instead of scrolling aimlessly on my phone. Writing a single sentence, then another, even when each one felt like pulling something jagged from my chest. I didn't think about whether it was good or bad. I didn't even think about where it was going. I only thought about movement, about proving to myself, over and over, that I hadn't stopped. The strangest part was how the quiet in the room started to change. At first, it was suffocating, heavy with the sound of my own breathing and the scratch of the pen. But as the hours passed, it became something else. I started hearing faint things I hadn't noticed before, the tick of the clock, the rustle of papers when I shifted them, the distant murmur of traffic outside. It was like the silence wasn't pressing against me anymore, but holding me up, letting me lean into it while I worked. By the end of the week, I realized I'd been wrong about something. I'd always thought persistence meant feeling strong, being able to fight every day without faltering. But it wasn't like that at all. It was messy. It was dragging yourself forward even when your feet felt cemented to the floor. It was showing up in ways so small they felt meaningless until, slowly, those moments stacked into something you could actually see. There was a night, late in that week, when I almost let it all go again. I'd been at my desk for hours, the words refusing to come, my frustration tightening like a knot in my chest. I pushed my chair back, ready to call it, ready to tell myself it could wait until tomorrow. But my eyes landed on the notebook from the first day, the page I'd written on when I'd barely been able to start. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't deep, but it was proof that I'd started from nothing once, and I could do it again. I picked up the pen and forced out another line, even though I hated it. And somehow, that made all the difference. I began to notice a pattern. The urge to give up never disappeared, just came and went like a tide. Some days it was so far out that I could barely feel it. Other days it crashed in hard, filling my head with the roar of doubt. But I learned that if I could just stand my ground long enough, it would always recede again. That was the real battle, not avoiding the tide, but outlasting it, the work. Itself started to shift, to little by little. I found myself not just pushing through, but getting caught up in moments where the world outside didn't exist. Hours would pass without me realizing, and when I finally looked up, I'd feel the strange mix of exhaustion and satisfaction that comes from being lost in something you care about. Those moments didn't happen every day, but when they did, they reminded me why I'd started in the first place. One evening, I stepped outside after finishing a long stretch of work. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain from earlier in the day. I looked up at the sky dark, but with a faint strip of fading gold along the horizon. It was the kind of sky you might miss if you weren't paying attention, the kind that lasted only minutes before melting into night. And I thought about how close I'd come to missing it, not just the sky, but this feeling of having done something, however imperfect, simply because I refused to stop. That's when it hit me. Persistence doesn't always look like progress from the outside. Sometimes it's invisible. Sometimes the only proof you have is the quiet knowledge that you kept going when no one was watching, when no one cared, when it would have been easier to disappear into the comfort of quitting. And maybe that's enough, because the day I didn't give up wasn't a single day at all, it was every day after that. It was waking up with the weight still on my shoulders and carrying it anyway. It was choosing the harder thing again and again, even when I couldn't see where it would lead. And it was standing there, at the end of it all, knowing that whatever happened next, I hadn't let myself walk away. It's strange how some moments can feel heavier than entire weeks. That fifth moment was one of them, a point where the air seemed thick enough to hold me in place, where my own thoughts turned sharp and relentless, cutting into me with a precision no one else could see. I had been pushing for so long that the line between progress and exhaustion had blurred, and somewhere in that haze, I found myself questioning whether all of it meant anything. The day started like any other. The alarm went off, and I rose mechanically. Each step from bed to desk rehearsed so many times it might as well have been muscle memory. But there was something different in the silence that morning, something heavy, a kind of stillness that didn't feel peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of every sound you made, the creak of the floorboards, the dull scrape of the chair legs, the faint clink of the mug as it met the table. I opened my notebook, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't know where to begin. The pages stared back at me, lines and scribbles from days before, some of them half-finished thoughts, others entire ideas I had abandoned mid-sentence. I flipped through them slowly, hoping to catch a spark of something, anything that could pull me forward. But all I saw were reminders of how far I still had to go. That's when the doubt started speaking louder. It wasn't a shout, it never is. It was a steady whisper, quiet enough to slip past my defenses, persistent enough to sink deep. You're wasting your time. You're not getting anywhere. Why keep going when no one would notice if you stopped? The words weren't dramatic, but they carried the kind of weight that could bend your spine if you let them settle too long. I remember leaning back in my chair, letting my eyes drift to the window. Outside, the sky was a pale grey, the kind that promised rain but hadn't yet decided to deliver it. I thought about how easy it would be to shut the notebook, to step away for just a day and convince myself it wasn't giving up, it was just taking a break. The temptation wasn't in quitting outright. It was in letting the edges of my effort fray until I couldn't tell the difference. I almost did it. My hand was halfway to closing the cover when I stopped, caught by a memory I hadn't thought about in years. It was from when I was a kid, struggling to learn how to swim. I'd been terrified of the deep end, convinced I'd sink if I let go of the wall. But there was this one day where I didn't let myself stop kicking, even when my arms ached and my lungs burned. And eventually, without realizing it, I was moving clumsy and slow, but moving without the wall to hold me. That day had changed something in me, though I'd forgotten it until now. The connection was instant and unsettling. I realized that maybe this wasn't about talent or luck or even the work itself. Maybe it was just about whether I could keep kicking when there was no wall in sight. So I forced myself to stay in the chair. I didn't promise a perfect sentence or even a coherent thought. I promised myself I would keep my pen moving for 15 minutes, no matter what came out. The first few lines were awful, fragmented, meaningless. I hated every word. But somewhere, in the middle of that messy scrawl, a single sentence landed in a way that felt different. Not brilliant, not world-changing, but honest. It was enough to make me forget, for a moment, how much I'd wanted to stop. That single sentence became 2, then a paragraph, then a page. The whisper of doubt didn't disappear, it stayed, lurking just at the edge of my mind, but it no longer controlled my hands. I realized then that persistence isn't about silencing the doubt. It's about moving anyway, about letting the work fill the space until the whisper becomes background noise. By the time I looked up, the pale grey sky outside had deepened into something darker, streaked with the slow crawl of evening clouds. The rain finally came, a steady rhythm against the window, and I realized I'd been working for hours without noticing. My back ached, my fingers were stiff, but I had pages in front of me, messy, imperfect pages that hadn't existed this morning. It struck me how easily this day could have gone differently. If I'd closed the notebook when I wanted to, if I'd stepped away for just a day, I might not have come back. That's the quiet danger of giving up. It rarely feels like a single, dramatic moment. It's more like a slow leak, the air slipping out of something you didn't even realize was deflating, until one day it's too flat to lift again. That evening, as I sat in the dim light of my desk lamp, I thought about how persistence often looks invisible from the outside. No one sees the hours spent wrestling with the urge to stop. No one feels the weight of those small decisions to stay just a little longer, to try just one more time. But those decisions stack on top of each other until they become something solid, something you can stand on when the ground feels unsteady. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won anything, but I felt anchored, as though by choosing to stay, I'd planted something deep enough to hold me through the next tide of doubt. And maybe that was enough, just knowing I could make it through one more day without letting go of the wall I'd built for myself. That fifth moment didn't end with a breakthrough, but it did end with the quiet certainty that I'd faced the worst of my urge to give up and outlasted it. That was the kind of progress no one else could see, but I could feel it, and that made all the difference. It's strange how some endings don't really feel like endings at all. They feel more like a slow, steady shift in the air, a quiet realization that something inside you has changed, even if the world outside remains the same. That sixth moment was exactly that. I didn't know it when it began. but it would be the point where the struggle I had been dragging behind me for so long would stop feeling like a burden and start feeling like a kind of armor dot. It wasn't dramatic. There was no swelling music, no cinematic light breaking through clouds. In fact, the day was still dull and grey, the kind of weather that makes everything feel just a little heavier. My desk lamp cast a soft circle of light over the scattered pages in front of me, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could look so ordinary while my thoughts felt like a storm barely held together. The night before, I'd gone to bed with the familiar weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. Not just physical exhaustion, but the kind that seeps into your bones, the kind that makes you wonder if you're carrying more than you're built for. I had worked late, trying to wring something meaningful out of my efforts, but all I managed were half-formed ideas and pages full of revisions that felt like erasing myself one line at a time. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The house was still, the street outside empty. It was the kind of silence that made you notice the sound of your own breathing, the faint hum of the lamp, even the way your heartbeats seemed louder in moments of stillness. I sat down at my desk, but instead of reaching for the pen or the keyboard, I just stared. That was when it hit me, not as a sudden thought, but as something that had been building for weeks without me realizing. I had been so focused on reaching the big moment, the grand breakthrough, that I hadn't noticed how much of my life was happening in the small, unremarkable moments between. I had been waiting for a finish line that didn't exist, chasing some invisible point where everything would suddenly make sense. And in doing so, I'd been blind to the fact that every single day I didn't quit was the very thing I had been looking for. It's not that the work got easier that day, it didn't. The sentences still fought me. The ideas still slipped through my fingers like water. But something inside me shifted, just enough to take the edge off the constant pressure I had been putting on myself. I realized that not giving up didn't mean charging forward every single second. It meant standing your ground, even when the ground felt like it was shaking beneath you. I thought about all the days before this one, the ones where I had almost walked away. They didn't feel like failures anymore. They felt like proof that I could carry the weight, even if I stumbled under it. Proof that I could face the same doubts again and again without letting them win. There's a certain power in knowing that you've already survived your worst moments. It doesn't erase the difficulty, but it does give you a quiet confidency voice that says, "You've been here before, and you're still here now." That voice became my anchor. Every time the doubt crept in, every time the temptation to quit whispered in my ear, I had something to answer with. Not an argument, not a pep talk, just the simple truth. I had already proven I could stay. By midday, I was still at my desk. I had written less than I'd hoped, but more than I'd feared. I looked at the pages, messy, uneven. Instead of seeing what they lacked, I saw the fact that they existed at all. They were the physical proof of every moment I'd fought the urge to stop. And suddenly, that was enough. When the afternoon light began to fade, I didn't feel the usual knot of frustration in my chest. I wasn't counting the hours I'd lost or measuring my progress against an impossible standard. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The kind that comes when you finally understand that the fight isn't something to escape from, it's something to live alongside. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my room, I realized the sixth moment wasn't about reaching the end of my struggle. It was about changing the way I carried it. I stopped seeing it as a chain dragging behind me and started seeing it as a shield I had built. Piece by piece, every day I refused to give up. The truth is, there will always be more days like that grey, heavy and full of doubt. But now I know that those days don't erase my progress. They are my progress. And when the next storm comes, scratch, I'll be standing on the foundation I've been building all along. One quiet decision at a time. And maybe that's what not giving up really means, not the absence of struggle, but the decision to keep standing, even when standing still feels like the hardest thing in the world.